Welcome everyone to our program, which is titled Invisible Rivers Beneath Our Feet with Ric Hauer and Harvey Locke. Thank you all for joining us from all the different places where I see you're coming from. It's great to have you with us. This is Jane Lavino, and I'm the Sugden Chief Curator of Education here at the National Museum of Wildlife Art, and I am in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. This program this afternoon is a joint venture hosted by the National Museum of Wildlife Art and by the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative. And you'll be hearing from people mostly from the Yellowstone to Yukon organization. It's a joint Canada-US nonprofit organization. And if you know the National Museum of Wildlife Art, you'll know that we are also a nonprofit organization. Our host of the program, Harvey Locke of Yellowstone to Yukon, will speak briefly, and then Ric Hauer, who is our main presenter, will begin his presentation. And then at the end, Renee Krysko from the Yellowstone to Yukon organization will come on and will moderate the question and answer session. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A button, which should appear at the bottom of your screen if you move the cursor down to the bottom of your screen. I'd like to start with just a few words about Harvey Locke by way of introduction. Harvey Locke, as I mentioned, is associated with the Yellowstone to Yukon organization. He's the co-founder and a senior advisor for Yellowstone to Yukon, but he's also an international speaker, writer, and photographer. And he's an extremely strong advocate for wildlife conservation. Many of you will remember Harvey, especially those of you who have been to our museum over the years. He was a key organizer for the exhibit we had a few years ago that was called Yellowstone to Yukon, The Journey of Wildlife and Art. And if you missed it, I was told by Debbie Vassar, who runs our museum shop this afternoon, that she still has some books available and you should check it out. So I put that information at the top of the chat feature there in case you're interested in tracking down that book. Harvey, the National Museum of Wildlife Art considers you a dear friend. It's been wonderful working with you over the years, and it's a pleasure to see you again this afternoon. Thanks, Harvey, for being here.
Thank you, Jane. And it's always a pleasure for me to work with the National Museum of Wildlife Art because it's one of the most wonderful places. I like to call it the place that Carl built because of the Carl Rungus collection, which brings us together so strongly in the Yellowstone to Yukon region, from his studio here in Banff, his start in Wyoming. It's just, and that collection there just turns me on every time I get in your building. And so it's delightful to work with you on this. And this speaker series that we've started together, I think is a lot of fun to work on. And it's thrilling that we have Ric Hauer today for me to introduce. Ric Hauer was a professor of limnology for many years at the University of Montana. Ric did many distinguished things in his career, including he's one of the two editors of the classic book called Methods in Stream Ecology, which scientists use all over universities all over North America and on other continents to learn about the basics of how streams work. And I got to know Ric about 8 or 10 years ago working on the Flathead River on the Canada-US border. It starts in Canada and goes down into Montana. And I remember, I'll never forget, I don't think, Ric explaining to me how the gravel bed river system actually drives the whole landscape. It doesn't just drive the river, and it's not just because things come down for a drink, but it's really the heart of the whole system. And in many ways, the gravel bed rivers define the Yellowstone to Yukon region. And I'll just give an example. The Snake River that runs through Jackson Hole, the gravel bed river. The Upper Missouri is a gravel bed river. The Flathead is a gravel bed river. The Columbia is a gravel bed river. The Bow is a gravel bed river. All these rivers that people strongly associate with where they live in this region are gravel bed rivers because that's how the geology works. And one of our colleagues, when we worked on this paper together on gravel bed rivers, described Rick once as somebody who makes gravel exciting. And that's a very strange idea, to make gravel exciting, but Rick can do it. I think you'll find out really quickly. He's a wonderful colleague, and he's been a global leader in shifting people's perception about how these things actually work. And what's so cool about it is, after this lecture, you can go outside and stand on the banks of the Snake River or the Bow River, or wherever you are in a glaciated mountain landscape, and you will never see the landscape the same way again. And very few people have that gift of transforming perception. And Ric Hauer is one of those people. He's also a great guy to be outside with, and even taught me the name for a yellow-rumped warbler is actually the butterbutt. So many natural history things. So without further ado, Ric Hauer, tell us why gravel's exciting.
All right. Well, thank you, Harvey, and all of you out there across the country in COVID-19 land. I am going to start here by sharing my screen with everyone. There we go. So we titled this Invisible Rivers Beneath Our Feet. But in reality, what this is about is gravel bed rivers throughout the Yellowstone to Yukon region, and why these rivers are so important, and ultimately why you should care about them so much. So I'm going to organize, or I have organized this talk around a series of things. First is to talk a little bit about space and time as foundational concepts in stream and river ecology. And I'm going to spend just a short amount of time specifically on those, but I need to be able to introduce those to you in order for the rest of the talk to make sense. And then we'll talk about gravel bed river specifics, some of the basic characteristics and their functions, what their role is in regional biodiversity. And then we're going to talk a little bit about specific threats to them and relate those back to these foundational concepts. And then we'll just wrap it up at the end. So the first thing is that all the rivers of the world exist within 4 dimensions. The first is one that we think of quite often when we think of rivers, and it's that longitudinal concept of going down the stream and how they change from really, really small little streams that are greatly influenced by riparian vegetation that comes into the stream, all the way down to the really big river. And that particular concept was called the river continuum concept, and it deals with this longitudinal component of the river. The second idea is that rivers, most of the rivers of the world flood in some way, and they typically flood out across their surface, and that flooding, that pulse of flooding, is integral to how not only the river itself works, but how riparian zones, and in some cases, how those are affected across entire watersheds. The third component of this, in the X, Y, and Z of 3 spatial dimensions, is the vertical dimension. And it's something where the groundwater, or water that is traveling down through a channel, becomes interactive with the subsurface waters. So waters leave the channel, flow through the subsurface, and come back to the surface. That area below the surface of the channel is called the river's hyporheic zone. Hypo meaning under, rheic meaning river. So it's the under river. And that really gets at the very essence of this idea of when we're out around the river, oftentimes we're walking on top of the river, and we don't know that because it's below our feet. The fourth dimension is the dimension of time. And that means is that these systems inherently change through time. They're supposed to change. There's supposed to be a spatial component to this, something that we call a shifting habitat mosaic. So when we look out across a river or a stream in its riparian area, we see multiple different habitats, but they're moving around in time and in space. We call that the shifting habitat mosaic. So let's get into how this actually reveals itself in these gravel bed rivers. So gravel bed rivers occur literally across the entire globe, whether it's the Snake in Wyoming or in the Flathead in Montana, or in Patagonia in Chile, or on the island of New Zealand. Virtually everywhere where there is mountain landscapes, there are gravel bed rivers. Here in the Yellowstone to Yukon, these are, as Harvey had said, the dominant river type, all the way from the very southern edge of this Yellowstone to Yukon region, all the way up to the Yukon and into Alaska. So what is the geophysical basis of these gravel bed rivers? Well, they're not all the same all the way down the length of them. They change along their length. Part of them is running through very confined reaches, oftentimes controlled by bedrock or near bedrock and large boulders and cobble. But they also then transition into very unconfined reaches. On the left, what you see is an unconfined floodplain. And on the right, you see another basin that's an unconfined lake. These two, on a big geological scale, are virtually identical. If the lake were full of sediment, it would be a floodplain like we see on the left. And if the floodplain on the left did not have sediment in it, it would be a lake like we see on the right. That floodplain on the left, from the surface of the floodplain, is roughly 200 or 150 meters to bedrock. This lake on the right is about 150 meters to bedrock. So virtually they are small capture basins where one is filled with sediment, the other one is filled with water. This is a really important concept because the one on the left, that's the floodplain, actually is also full of water. It's full of water between the interstitial spaces of the cobble that fills is the sediment that fills the basin. The other thing is that these systems tend to be hydrologically driven by snowmelt. And the discharge that you see, which I'm sure most of us here, around, if you happen to be in the West, is likely that you're seeing a big snowmelt driven system going on right now in the river that's closest to you. Water is beginning to melt out of the mountains, flows down the tributaries and onto the valley floor, and you see this big flooding event. That flooding event mobilizes the cobble and the gravel and tears out parts of the floodplains in the riparian zone and recreates new surface. So when we go out onto these floodplains, what we see was we get down close to the river channel is a bare cobble surface. If you go to other places on the floodplain, you may see something like this. This is a place where the channel used to be, and the river moved out of this channel and moved to another location, leaving behind this abandoned channel. This happens to be a very old abandoned channel of maybe as much as 100 or 200 years. It's completely surrounded by the forest. It's well out on the floodplain. But this used to be the location of the main channel. What's left behind are ponds and flowing spring brooks. We also see old surfaces that are stacked on the top of soil. But below that soil, along this area which you see right here, is an old cobble bar. Every surface out on the floodplain at one time was a cobble bar like you're looking at here. It may have a very, very old surface where things have gone through plant succession and you have an old growth forest above it, or it may be much younger, as you're seeing here in the background. This is one of the research sites that I've spent a lot of time on. This is called the Nyack floodplain. It's on the middle fork of the Flathead. Right over here is Glacier National Park. Up over here is the Great Bear Wilderness. And here is the middle fork of the Flathead coming from this bottom right-hand corner. It flows onto the floodplain and then it exits the floodplain up here in this top left-hand corner. We're going to go through some data specifically about this so that you can get a feel for how these things really work. So here's a LiDAR image of that same floodplain. And if we zoom in within this black box, what we see is a relative elevation to water surface. And all of a sudden, all of this image of the LiDAR suddenly pops out at you, and you can see where the water has flowed over an extended period of time. This is a composite of channel positions that have been georectified from a series of aerial photographs beginning in 1945, going up through the mid-2000s. And one of the things that you will see is that this river, the river channel, has moved back and forth. It's been all over this floodplain. That leads to a series of incredibly important properties. For one thing, it leads to a groundwater surface water interaction. And I talked a little bit up earlier about the hyporheic zone. So this is the groundwater of subsurface and lateral flow of the river, composed primarily of river origin water. And so in this particular sequence, what you're going to see is beginning down here in the lower right corner, the river on this particular date was running at about 430 cubic feet per second, or around 12.2 cubic meters per second. Now, if we move downstream from that, what we see is that the amount of water in the channel has decreased from 12 down to 9 cubic meters per second. It has lost roughly 24% of the flow in the channel as the water is leaving the channel as it's coming onto the floodplain. And it's diving down into the cobble in the interstitial space that's below the surface. That continues as we continue moving down the channel. By the time we get down to this location here, we've lost roughly 30% of the total water that entered the floodplain at the top. And as it's flowing down, the water is literally pouring out of the channel and into the subsurface gravel. We move down to here, and there's a little creek that comes in from the side. It brings in about 3 cubic meters per second at this particular date. And if we go down below this, right here, we're back up to 13 cubic meters. If we take out the 3 from the creek, we've actually now seen a gain of 16% from what came onto the channel. So what we have is 16% back into the channel, moving down here in a distance from here to here of about 300 meters. We then lose 30 to 40% of the water out of the channel again. And then that continues as we move down, back in, back out, back in, back out. So you see this sequence occurring where the water is flowing into and out of this big bowl of gravel as the river is flowing across the surface of it. So how fast does that water actually move? And how long does it stay under the subsurface? Well, we can see how long this happens by measuring the amount of radon. This is the same gas that you don't want to have in your basement, right? But it's radioactive, and when it's out on the surface, the amount of radon in the water is very low. And when the water goes into the subsurface, radon begins to enter the water. And it does so over about a 10 to 15 day period. So if you measure the amount of radon that's in the water coming out of the floodplain, out of the subsurface, you can measure how long it's been in the subsurface. So here is residence times of subsurface water coming, groundwater, that hyporheic groundwater. So the water's coming out of the channel, going into the subsurface. And if you'll look, you'll see that some of this water is in the subsurface for half a day or maybe a full day. But look at the distances away from the channel. The water in the subsurface is moving at extremely high groundwater speeds. Typical groundwater might move maybe 1 or 2 meters in a day. Here, the groundwater is moving hundreds of meters in an hour. It's absolutely phenomenal how fast this water moves. Now, if we go to this particular location on the floodplain and take an oblique look at it, it looks like this. Now, if we take a vertical view down from the top, that same site looks like this. And if we put a thermal infrared image over it, it looks like that thermal colorized image looks like this. And these are the temperatures that correspond to that water. Notice over here, we've got temperatures as high as 22 degrees. The main channel is flowing at 16 degrees C. The tributary is coming in at 12 degrees C, but the groundwater that's upwelling in that site is at 7 degrees C. So you see this incredible variation in water temperatures depending upon where you're located, even in this one channel. It's not a single, okay, the water temperature is this. It turns out that there's incredibly high diversity of water temperatures driven by this groundwater surface water exchange, which even extends into the winter. So in the summer, the groundwater coming to the surface cools the water, but in the winter, what was really super, super cold and it froze the surface, that same groundwater is now coming up at maybe 2, 3, or 4 degrees centigrade. And it's actually warming and making it so that there are parts of the river that stay open. Okay, so here we are looking at the Flathead River in southeastern British Columbia. The size of the river is not just what you see in this channel. The river is actually this wide. And there is water leaving the channel, going through the gravel of the subsurface, hundreds of meters laterally away from the river channel, and in depth, it's going down tens of meters. So this is an expansive river. It is not simply water running down a channel. And this has incredible implications for ecology. Now, here it is in southeastern British Columbia, but how about someplace like here? This is the Snake River, just downriver from Jackson on the way down to Hobart. Maybe many of you who maybe live in the Jackson area or visited there have been through and seen this exact same location. If you look down on this river, what you'll see here is the channel. But look at where this river has been in the recent past. These are all what we call paleo channels. This is where the river had been. But this is the expansion of the floodplain. It's actually literally from valley wall to valley wall. Okay, so let's catch up with what we've seen so far. This is an illustration. It's sort of a cartoon of what we've been talking about. So we've got water coming onto the floodplain. Here's the floodplain. And it flows subsurface, and we see this in these big blue arrows. It also exchanges multiple times in and out of the channel at a near surface level. And if you look, you'll see little smiley faces here. What those are places where the channel had been, and the channel moved, and it leaves behind these what we call preferential flow pathways, where the flow moves very, very fast. Now, what does this ultimately result from? Okay, so the floodplain landscape itself is created and it's maintained by a whole series of biophysical processes, by the hydrology, pounding this thing every year in the flooding event, and that flooding event then mobilizes the gravel and moves it around. This causes a dynamic habitat mosaic, where the key word here is not just habitat in a mosaic, it's that this thing is dynamic. It moves around through time. The next thing is that this subsurface hyporheic, what we call the alluvial aquifer, is characterized by this river origin water, and it flows through the gravel in the subsurface, literally from floodplain edge to floodplain edge, and from the top of the floodplain to the bottom. This is maintained through by this legacy of what we call cut and fill alluviation, with highly sorted open network of cobble and an interstitial flows that are left behind by these old river channels. All very interesting. It is really cool. Why should you care, right? Well, here's the reason you should care. Turns out that these gravel bed rivers are by far the most important feature for nature throughout the Yukon to Yellowstone, or the Yellowstone to Yukon region. So let's visit this a little bit better. Let's start at the base of the food web. As this water is going into the subsurface, it is being filtered by the cobble and the gravel, and organic matter is retained in the gravels. This organic matter decomposes, and as it decomposes, it releases nitrogen and phosphorus. As those nutrients then are carried and brought back to the surface, you get these locations of high productivity. This is not pollution. This is a natural phenomenon. And in these upwelling zones, what we see is a burst of chlorophyll and a burst of algal cells, where this is the productivity that is driving this system. And here are all these little spots of these high productivity zones. This then travels up through the trophic dynamics of the entire system. Among the grazing aquatic insects, where the water is upwelling and bringing nutrients back to the surface, the insects get larger than the same group of insects a few hundred meters away. Under similar kinds of conditions, the only difference is that one is being fed with nutrients coming back to the surface. Well, what about at the other end? Well, among those that are shredders, or those that are collector-gatherers, in the downwelling zones, they get larger because that's where the organic matter is being trapped. So depending upon this inflow of water or this outflow of nutrients, depends upon which organisms or which types of the food web become the largest and the most robust. through those preferential flow pathways. And you can see one right here. Look at this open interstitial space with water flowing through it. And off channel, there are hundreds, thousands, millions, billions of aquatic insects that are crawling through the interstitial space away from the river channel. If you put in a well and you drill this well down into the subsurface water, you can pump out aquatic insects out of the well. So you end up with these open, highly sorted zones of the floodplain that have what are hyporheic organisms specific to that habitat. And this then becomes an integral part of the overall food web. What about fish? Well, it turns out that fish, especially salmonids and spawning habitat, are specifically selecting sites where there's groundwater coming back out of the ground as an input into the river channel. So the higher the groundwater input here, the higher the number of reds of salmonids. So the salmon are specifically smelling out the location where the water is coming out of the ground and back into the surface. So here's an example. Here we have the edge of this floodplain. This floodplain, again, it happens to be the Flathead up in Canada. And here's the edge. These are the locations of groundwater upwelling here. And these red dots are the spawning sites by specific bull trout. They're specifically picking out the spots where the groundwater is upwelling back into the channel. So it's not just fish and it's not just aquatic insects. The amphibians are also using these sites that have been created by the fluvial process of the river, such as this pond. Now this is getting really wild. What about birds? How do they connect to these floodplains and these gravel bed rivers? Well, throughout northwestern Wyoming, Montana, western Alberta, eastern BC, basically the Yellowstone to Yukon region, we know that there's roughly 230 birds plus. 90% of the birds use floodplain habitat for some significant portion of their life histories. They might not breed there. They may be upland species, but even the upland species are coming to the floodplains during their migrations because this is where the food is. And it's where the food is earliest in the season or late in the season when they're preparing to outmigrate. Also, of these 200 species, almost half of them are specific nesters on floodplains. Basically, if we lose our gravel bed rivers and we lose the floodplains associated with them and their proper functioning condition, we will massively damage our bird populations. Vegetation. Out across the vegetation, it turns out across the surface of the floodplain. What about the vegetation, not just for that, but what about for the entire region? It turns out that if you start in the middle of the floodplain and you go to the alpine zone, you will fill about 70% of your biodiversity species list before you leave the floodplain. So roughly 70% of the biodiversity is represented specifically on surfaces associated with the floodplains of these gravel bed rivers. Not only that, but there's a distinct difference between downwelling and upwelling zones on the floodplain. It turns out that in the old growth gallery forest, in the upwelling zones, there is far more species diversity than in a similar location on the same floodplain, except where the water is downwelling. So this downwelling, upwelling is extremely important. What about the ungulates and their predators? Well, as it turns out, the ungulates, whether they happen to be, in this case, elk, or whether they're caribou, they're spending an incredible amount of time on the floodplains. Not too surprisingly, wolves spend a great deal of their time on the floodplains as well. In the purple, what we're looking at is GPS data of the elk. In the red, we're looking at the GPS data of the wolves. And it turns out that the little green stars, these are all the locations where the wolves have successfully made a winter kill on the elk. It turns out that 90% of the predation takes place down on the floodplain. So the floodplains are not just where the animals are hanging out, it's also the arena where the battle of predator-prey interactions take place. Here are the interactions. Basically, what's going on here is elk are running up and down the floodplain along the riparian zone of the gravel bed rivers, and they're being chased back and forth and up and down by the wolves. What about the grizzly bears? Turns out that floodplains are critical grizzly bear habitat. Oftentimes we have thought about grizzly bears as being sort of mountain species, right? Up in the mountains. They are, but not all the time. They spend critical portions of their time down on the floodplain. So here is the springtime data that go for this particular location. This is the boundary between the United States and Canada. This is Montana. This is southeastern British Columbia. Here is the North Fork of the Flathead flowing out of Canada down, and right here is Glacier Park. These are the floodplains associated with that. As you can, and here is this is the image that it looks like, and you've seen this image before, but this is what it looks like. And here are the GPS locations of grizzly bears from the first emergence in April and May into mid-June. Look at where the grizzly bears are. Turns out that they are co-located with the floodplains over and over and over again. And here's that image with the bull trout spawning, and it's located right here. These things are overlapping each other, on top of each other. And it's all taking place on these river and their associated floodplains. So let's do a quick review and summary. Let's start down here on A. Here's their floodplain. We have the trapping of particles. They're decomposed into nutrients that come to the surface. We also have aquatic insects in this subsurface. As the water is coming to the surface, it is being modified by its temperatures for spawning by trout and by the rearing of their young. It's also the place where birds congregate and are spending an incredible part of their life histories located here. It's where the amphibians are. It's where the big megafauna are located. It's where these guys get chased around by, this is where the predator-prey interactions take place. It's because of these temperature regimes and the phosphorus and the nitrogen coming to the surface. It's the first food that greens up in the spring. It is the most nutritious. It's a place where the animals go and congregate, all the way, basically from microbes all the way to grizzly bears. Paradoxically, gravel bed river floodplains are also disproportionately unprotected, where there are human developments and these things get highly concentrated. So let's look at some of the threats. One of them, it is pervasive and it lays like a blanket over everything, over all the rest of the threats. This particular threat lays on a surface over all of it. Whether it is winter flooding, like we see in this picture, or drought and wildfires, here's some basic data. Looking at the change in warmer air temps going up, our temperatures, air temperatures are going to be going up. We're going to be seeing a declining snowpack. It's going down by as much as 60 to 80%. We're going to have altered hydrology. Look where the hydrologies are going to be most dramatically affected. It's going to be in this Yellowstone to Yukon region. This is an aquatic composite climate change risk assessment. Look at where the risks are taking place, all the way from extremely high to low. So part of the Yellowstone Grand Teton area encompasses both low all the way to very high. And we see this all over here across the West. Another significant threat is hard rock mining. This is the Rio Tinto River in Spain. The Rio Tinto looks like this and has looked like this since mining began here, taking place by the Romans. What you're seeing here is leftover mining pollution from the Roman era. When we open up mines, what the pollution does is it is pervasive, it is highly destructive, and it lasts an unbelievably long period of time because we are making geologic change. This is not just something quick and then it's over with. This is a geomorphic geologic change that lasts millennia. This is all the locations. There's over 64,000 abandoned mines, hard rock mines around the United States. I'm sure that if you did something similar to this in Canada, you'd see the same thing. We also have threats of coal mining. These particular coal mines that you see imaged here are in the East Kootenay coal fields of British Columbia, south of Banff, north of Glacier National Park. The removal of coal and the building of waste, rock waste from this coal mining process leads to toxic waste that pollute the water. In this case, it's primarily selenium. But here's something for you to consider. As we look across through time, even looking at the most modern mining techniques, there is not a single known case of mining occurring in a wet environment like we have in the Pacific Northwest of North America, where the toxic waste has not gotten into and polluted the water. In some cases, for tens or hundreds of kilometers downstream. These things tend to be direct toxicity to aquatic life, and they have these incredible cascading consequences. Another type of mining that is pervasive is gravel mining, gravel pits down on floodplains. This water that's filling this pit is coming right out of this river here, flowing through the interstitial space. What you're looking at here is an exposure of the hyporheic zone. forming these ponds. This all is part of the river. This is not something separate. And these are incredibly destructive to our rivers and river systems. Here's another threat: levees and bank hardening. We build levees and we harden banks because we have private property and we don't want the river to move. But what we learned earlier is that the river has to move. It's one of the 4 dimensions of rivers. They have a shifting habitat mosaic. If you have no longer a shift, look at what happens. You no longer have a vibrant gallery forest. These are really, really old cottonwood trees. And these old cottonwood trees are going to get old and they're going to start falling over and they're going to be dying. And then you have no gallery forest. And the reason is because you have interrupted the plant succession process by not having the river moving around, creating new and open habitat for the plants to be able to begin their successional process. Here's another one: floodplain ex-urban development. Why on earth are we building or allowing to have built subdivisions down on floodplains? This is crazy stuff. And the people who build here, they don't really know any better. If they knew better, they wouldn't do it. But here, this is on the banks of the Snake River. This is on the banks of the Bitterroot River, just south of Missoula, Montana. Another threat: dams and excessive water diversions. And we think about these things as big dams and what they do. What I'm going to talk about very briefly is the Palisades Dam and the Snake River. This particular dam, built in the 1950s, has led to a series of things. One is the near destruction of the Yellowstone cutthroat trout and replacement by exotic species. In this case, it happened to be rainbows. Now, rainbows are very prized by fishermen, but they're non-native. This area also had a rare and endangered plant called the Ute ladytress. It was losing its gallery forest, and large gravel bars, rather than being open and having new vegetation growing on it, are covered with reed canary grass. The reason for this is, here's in 2 example years: 1948 before building Palisades Dam, 2000 after, both with exactly the same amount of water coming through the system that year. But look at what happens. What they're doing intentionally is trapping the water in the reservoir and preventing the flood. But we know that the system has to flood in order to maintain the shift in the shifting habitat mosaic, to maintain this X, Y, and Z component of the spatial diversity. So here's that system before the dam. This is annual maximum discharges. Look at how high these maximum discharges would achieve some years compared to what's going on now. Basically, it's all the big floods are gone. What that did was it gave us an opportunity. Me and my colleagues, we happened to work on this river for a number of years. We came up with a plan to re-engage the river and its floodplain. We called it an ecologically based systems management. What we did is we had the managers who are controlling the dam put floods back in the river, specifically to mobilize the gravel, to give space for regeneration of trees, particularly cottonwoods, and the regeneration into the gallery forest. Here is in 2002, and here is 3 years later after they have instituted this ecologically based systems management. What you see is This channel has been completely avulsed out of and been filled with gravel. It has been reconfigured through this space, through here, built large open gravel, and there we see an increase now, or a return of regeneration of cottonwoods back into the system. Okay. So here's, we're going to start wrapping this up. So what is the scientific basis for ecological restoration in these gravel bed rivers? Well, a couple of things. First, although they occupy less than 3% of the land area of the Y2Y region, these gravel bed rivers and their associated floodplains account for more than 60% of the vegetation, more than 70% of aquatic food webs, and over 80% of the bird diversity. It's the primary arena for the interaction between predators and prey and competition among the large megafauna of elk, caribou, wolves, grizzly bears. These are the sites that are disproportionately concentrating diverse habitats. The reason is because the river is mobilizing and it's cutting and filling. It's cutting old surfaces and it's making new ones. It is penetrating down through the subsurface where organic matter is being recycled, releasing nutrients. So we have nutrients recycling in this system. This is where the productivity is taking place. This is where the nutrients are coming from off of the landscape and being focused down on the valley floor in the river. This is where the species interactions are taking place. This is where temperatures are being modified. In the summer, it's cooler, and in the winter, it's warmed. And these are the connectivity corridors between populations. So if you're going to connect a population, you keep these corridors open for the populations to connect across broad landscapes. Okay. Here's the final thought. Because gravel bed rivers are by far the most important feature for nature throughout the Yellowstone to Yukon region, because of this, this is the place that we must spend a significant focus for our regional conservation. If we want to save big wildlife, if we want to save birds, if you're concerned about food webs, all the way from microbes, all the way up to grizzly bears, the focus needs to be to a significant degree on preserving and conserving these floodplains and the rivers that flow through them. This is the paper that a lot of this comes out of. It was contributed by a wonderful suite of colleagues here, one of whom is on this with me and was kind enough to introduce me, Harvey Locke. This is literally a representative group of scientists from microbes all the way to grizzly bears. And we were all stunned by what came out of the workshop that led to this paper. It expanded all of our ideas about, even though I'd been working on gravel bed rivers for 40 years, it was absolutely mind-blowing to me when I saw the grizzly bear data co-located with the floodplain data the way it was. I'd never seen it before. Neither had anybody else. But if you're interested in this paper, the folks at Y2Y and at the Wildlife Museum will be mailing I'm sending you a copy of the PDF of this particular paper. And with that, I am going to close. I'm going to stop my sharing and turn this over to Renee.
Everyone hear me? Great. Thank you so much, Rick. As expected, very informative and incredibly compelling. So thank you for taking the time to share with us this super interesting paper and work. With the amount of time, we have about 5 to 7 minutes left. So we'll take some questions, and there is some already that are in the Q&A box, but if you have some more, by all means, just type your questions in that little Q&A and we'll get through as many as we possibly can. So I'm going to kick us off with one of the questions that's here. Let's get started with Lisa Simmons. Rick explained that the entire floodplain is covered in gravel. Actually, sorry, no, it's covered in cobble bar. Why is that? Is that due to the movement of the river channel or glaciers or both?
Initially, it is the deposition from the glaciers. So the amount of material that is mobilized fills the basin. So if there was a lot of material moving down the river post-glaciation, it has these little basins. The basin fills with cobble and then the river reworks it. If there's not enough, then you end up with a lake. But you have basically bedrock coming to the surface. They may be 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers apart from one another. And bedrock at lower elevations between these upper sort of what we call nick points. And that gets filled with sediment, and then the river works it and reworks it. And as it's reworking that surface, it's tearing out old material. That old material may be from a year ago, or it could be 5 years ago, or it could be 100 years ago, or it could be 500 years ago. And as it does that, it redeposits in a brand new cobble bar surface to the point where everything out there is a cobble bar with something else put on top of it. And that those cobble bars have the open interstitial space with water flowing through it, basically from valley wall to valley wall.
Great. I'm also just going to let everybody know, because I know it's getting closer to 5 o'clock, so some people may have to go. Ali will probably put up a little poll that will pop up, and it asks just 5 quick questions, I believe it is, just to get some feedback from you. The museum and Y2Y continually try to create quality programming that is of interest to you, and so your feedback will be greatly appreciated so that we can continue to do so. The next question, and you kind of touched on this, but as this type of river can move miles over many years, what special precautions do cities, individuals need to take when city planning and building houses? And coming from Canmore, I'm particularly interested.
Whoever sent that in, bless you. It is critically important that we not build things on floodplains that begin to constrain them. As we confine them and constrain what are really these unconfined open floodplains, a whole series of really bad things start happening. One of them is that the channel becomes embedded with sediment because the river can't move laterally, cutting banks and redepositing material. The material flows down and gets stuck in between the cobble. That prevents water from leaving the channel, and you lose all this groundwater surface water interaction, the cooling effect of the water in the summer and the refugio that goes with that, the warming of the water in the winter and the refugio that goes with that. You lose the nutrients that are being recycled. A whole plethora of things, bad things happen, all the way up to a loss of the surface age structure of the vegetation. So if you, over a 50 or 60-year period, all you end up with are very, very old vegetation, no young. So like if you went to a country and everybody in the country was 65 years old or older, you would go, oh, well, there's still people that live here, but this country is in a whole lot of, it's been a huge, huge problem. And in another 30 or 40 years from now, they're going to be all gone. That's the same problem that we have with floodplains when they're confined by levees, riprap, people building houses down on them. All these things that take away the dynamics of the floodplain. So
I think,
yeah, the politicians need to wake up to this too.
Stephen Woodley said, should we move Banff town site to the subalpine?
Actually, Banff is not in that bad of a place. It's actually wisely built on a sort of a promontory. Downtown Canmore, on the other hand, was not built in a wise place. And it's built right down on the floodplain. And as you can walk out of, basically the Y2Y office, and you walk about, 100 meters, and you're walking right past a spring brook that is hyporheic water that's emerged out of the floodplain, 2 miles upriver. It is, or upslope. I mean, it's just built in a crazy place. And it will flood. Parts of, Calgary are suffering from the same thing. It flooded, 1927, I think, is the year it flooded. They came out with a big report on don't build down on the floodplain. That report was immediately forgotten about 7 years later, and they built down on the floodplain, and then the whole thing flooded again in 2013. And so if something is not done, that system will flood again. Calgary will be flooded again. And the cycle goes on. But we need to be far more wiser than what we have been.
So I'll take one more question, and this is from Bill Klein. And Harvey, you may want to pop in and say something on this too, but what is Y2Y doing to leverage this information to educate individuals and especially communities in order for their more clearly understanding the importance of protecting this important habitat?
Oh, I'm going to let Harvey take that one.
Well, one of the things we've been doing is just trying to let people know what's going on with these gravel bed river floodplains, because people don't know. And the second thing we've tried to do a couple of years ago, Y2Y had a communities kind of a gathering trying to get people thinking about these kinds of broader questions. All of our private land acquisition program has been focused on securing corridors and the intactness of gravel bed river floodplains. We didn't know that's what we were doing when we started, but it turned out that it was exactly what we were doing, based on data provided by people like Dr. Michael Proctor, whose data Rick showed earlier in this. And we've got, Rick is going to help us do an assessment of all the gravel bed rivers in the system. That is going to help us think holistically about the whole thing. But I think most important is that when you leave this webinar, go out and look at the river that you live near, if you live in the Yellowstone-Yukon region, and you will see everything Rick said. And when you see it, you think differently, and you would behave differently if you saw it differently. And one of the things we're trying to do with our grand vision of Yellowstone to Yukon is help people see where they actually live and what's actually going on, in the hope that that might inform people to behave differently and how they think about stuff. And so dam removals, like for example, one really cool thing happened in Banff. Actually invited Rick up to Banff. We had an old dam for the town's water supply. There was a great fear of releasing the sediment behind the dam. Should they remove the dam? Should they not? And when Rick explained that, well, it's just a seasonal pulse, you can pull the dam out, but be sure you pull it out in the spring when the system's adapted to that flush don't pull it out in August when it'll cause a disaster. The thing's been removed, and we've actually restored a river system here in Banff Park, partly with Ric's advice. And it's the broad idea is rivers really matter a ton. We all need to talk about it. We need to shift our perception. These valley bottoms matter more than anything else in the whole system. I didn't know that when we started Yellowstone to Yukon almost 30 years ago. I didn't really understand it until I started working with Ric and learning all this amazing stuff. And now you know it, so please share the gospel.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. I think we're going to bring this to a close as we are a little bit after 5. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We had an amazing turnout. Over 100 people were on this webinar, so thank you very much for being here. Harvey, thank you. Jane, of course, thanks to you and the museum. We really love this partnership. And last but not least, Ric, thank you for making gravel really exciting. I'm always amazed when you do it.
Sure.
And just to remind everybody, we will be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who registered, so you'll be getting both a copy of this presentation as well as a copy of the actual paper that Ric mentioned. And if you have any questions, by all means, let us know. Thank you so much. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.